Being a ship captain is one of the most responsibility-heavy positions in the world. Captains are entrusted with millions of dollars worth of vessel and cargo, hundreds or thousands of lives, and the duty to make correct decisions in situations where mistakes can be catastrophic. You might think people given such responsibility would exercise extreme caution and follow established safety protocols. Then there were these captains, who proved that arrogance, negligence, incompetence, and sheer stupidity can turn even the most advanced vessels into coffins at the bottom of the ocean. Buckle up for a devastating journey through maritime disasters that should never have happened. 1. In 2012, Captain Francesco Schettino sailed the cruise ship Costa Concordia dangerously close to Giglio Island off the Italian coast to perform a sail-by salute for a retired captain living there. Schettino deviated from the approved route without authorization, bringing the 950-foot cruise ship within 500 feet of shore in shallow, rocky waters. The ship struck rocks that tore a 160-foot gash in the hull, flooding multiple compartments. As the ship began sinking and listing heavily to one side, Schettino abandoned ship while over 300 passengers and crew were still aboard, claiming he had fallen into a lifeboat. An Italian Coast Guard officer famously ordered Schettino to get back on board for fuck's sake. But Schettino refused. 32 people died in the disaster. Schettino was convicted of manslaughter, causing a maritime disaster, and abandoning ship. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. The disaster was entirely preventable. Schettino had sailed off course to show off, hit rocks that were clearly marked on charts, then abandoned hundreds of people, including elderly and disabled passengers who couldn't evacuate. His cowardice and criminal negligence made him internationally despised and turned Schettino into synonymous with cowardly incompetence. 2. In 1912, Captain Edward Smith of the RMS Titanic ignored multiple ice warnings from other ships and maintained the Titanic's speed at 22 knots through an area known to have icebergs. Smith had received at least 6 warnings about ice in the area, but didn't slow down or alter course significantly. The night was moonless with calm seas, conditions that make icebergs harder to spot since there are no waves breaking against them. At 11:40 p.m., lookouts spotted an iceberg directly ahead. The ship couldn't turn in time and struck the iceberg, which opened the hole below the waterline across multiple watertight compartments. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in 4 compartments, but couldn't survive 6 compartments flooding. The ship sank in less than 3 hours, killing approximately 1,500 people. Captain Smith went down with his ship, which was considered honorable at the time, but his decision to maintain speed through known ice fields was reckless and directly caused the disaster. The Titanic was considered unsinkable, and Smith's overconfidence in the vessel's design combined with his desire to make good time led him to ignore obvious warnings. The disaster remains one of history's most famous maritime catastrophes, and while Smith maintained traditions by going down with the ship, his pre-collision decisions killed over 1,500 people who trusted him to navigate safely. 3. In 1987, Captain David Lurie of the Ferry Herald of Free Enterprise sailed from Zeebrugge, Belgium, with the bow doors still open, allowing water to flood the car deck. The assistant boatswain responsible for closing the bow doors was asleep in his cabin, and neither the captain nor the first officer verified that the doors were closed before departing. This was despite company procedures requiring confirmation of door closure. Water entering through the open bow doors quickly flooded the car deck, causing the ferry to become unstable. Within 90 seconds of leaving port, the ship capsized onto its side in shallow water. The disaster killed 193 passengers and crew who were trapped inside the capsized vessel or died from hypothermia in the cold water. Investigation revealed systemic failures, including no warning lights on the bridge to indicate whether bow doors were open or closed, pressure to maintain tight schedules that discouraged thorough safety checks, and a corporate culture that prioritized speed over safety. Captain Lurie and several officers were initially charged with manslaughter, but the charges were eventually dropped due to the systemic nature of the failures. However, Lurie's decision to sail without verifying that the vessel was sealed was the direct cause of the disaster. The Herald of Free Enterprise disaster led to major reforms in ferry safety regulations, but 193 people died because a captain didn't verify his ship was ready for sea. 4. In 1989, Captain Joseph Hazelwood of the oil tanker Exxon Valdez was drunk and not on the bridge when his ship ran aground on Bligh Reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound, spilling 11 million gallons of crude oil. Hazelwood had been drinking in his cabin and had left the bridge in control of the third mate, who was not qualified to navigate that section of water. Hazelwood had radioed that he was altering course to avoid ice but failed to properly supervise the course change. The ship struck the reef, puncturing 8 of 11 cargo tanks. The environmental disaster devastated Alaska's coastline, killing hundreds of thousands of seabirds, thousands of sea otters, and destroying fisheries. Cleanup costs exceeded $2 billion. Hazelwood was convicted of negligent discharge of oil, but acquitted of more serious charges. His blood alcohol content hours after the grounding was still above legal limits, proving he'd been heavily intoxicated while responsible for the vessel. The Exxon Valdez disaster became synonymous with environmental catastrophe and corporate negligence. While systemic failures at Exxon contributed to the disaster, Hazelwood's decision to drink heavily while in command and then abandon the bridge to an unqualified officer directly caused one of history's worst oil spills. 5. In 2015, Captain Michael Davidson of the cargo ship El Faro sailed directly into Hurricane Joaquin despite weather forecasts clearly showing the storm's path. El Faro was a 790-foot cargo ship traveling from Jacksonville to Puerto Rico. Davidson received multiple weather updates showing Joaquin strengthening to Category 3 with predicted path directly across El Faro's route. Rather than delaying departure or significantly altering course, Davidson made only minor course adjustments and maintained schedule, apparently confident he could skirt the storm. El Faro sailed directly into Joaquin's path. The ship lost power, began taking on water, and sank with all 33 crew members. The ship's voyage data recorder was recovered from 15,000 feet deep and revealed that Davidson had dismissed concerns from crew members and believed he could navigate around the storm. The recording captured the final hours as the ship lost propulsion and began sinking, with crew members questioning Davidson's decisions until the end. Investigation concluded that Davidson's decision to sail into a known hurricane rather than waiting or taking a safer route was the direct cause of the disaster. El Faro was also an aging vessel with known issues, but it would have completed the voyage safely if Davidson had simply waited for the hurricane to pass. All 33 crew members died because their captain was overconfident and unwilling to delay schedule. 6. In 1994, Captain Yevgeny Grin of the ferry, MS Estonia, failed to secure the bow visor properly and sailed into rough seas in the Baltic Sea. The bow visor, which covered the bow door, detached in heavy seas and pulled the bow door open. Water flooded the car deck, causing the ferry to list heavily and sink within 30 minutes. Of the 989 people aboard, 852 died in one of Europe's worst maritime disasters. Captain Grin went down with the ship. Investigation revealed that the bow visor locking mechanism had been compromised and required repair, but the ferry had sailed anyway due to schedule pressure. The captain's decision to sail in rough seas with a vessel he knew had visor issues directly contributed to the disaster. Survivors described the ship listing so quickly that escape became impossible for most passengers, particularly those sleeping below deck. The Estonia disaster led to significant changes in ferry safety regulations, but over 850 people died because the captain sailed a vessel with known structural issues into conditions it couldn't handle. 7. In 2014, Captain Lee Jun-seok of the ferry MV Seawol ordered passengers to stay put, while he and his crew abandoned ship as the vessel was sinking after an improper turn caused cargo to shift. The Seawol was carrying 476 people, including 325 high school students on a field trip. Captain Lee made a sharp turn that caused improperly secured cargo to shift, making the vessel unstable. As the ship began listing, Lee ordered passengers to remain in their cabins, while he and most of the crew evacuated. Passengers, trusting the captain's instructions, stayed put as water flooded the vessel. The ship capsized and sank, killing 304 people, including 250 high school students who drowned while waiting for rescue that never came. Captain Lee was captured on video fleeing the ship wearing only underwear and a t-shirt, having changed out of his uniform to avoid identification. He was rescued while hundreds of passengers drowned, following his orders to stay put. Lee was convicted of murder for ordering passengers to remain in place while he evacuated and sentenced to life in prison. The Sewol disaster shocked South Korea and led to widespread reforms. The disaster was caused by overloading, improper cargo securing, and illegal modifications to the vessel. But Captain Lee's decision to order passengers to stay while he fled turned a maritime accident into mass murder. Parents watched helplessly from shore as their children's text messages described rising water and their desperate hope that rescuers would arrive. They never did because the captain had abandoned them. 8. In 1994, Captain Vasilis Ioannis of the cruise ship MS Achille Lauro was in port when fire broke out. But his emergency response was so inadequate that the ship eventually sank, despite being near shore with rescue resources available. The fire started in the engine room while the ship was off Somalia. Ioannis's confused and panicked response led to delayed evacuation and poor coordination with rescue ships. 2 passengers died, and the ship burned for days before sinking. Investigation revealed Ioannis had failed to properly train crew on firefighting procedures, and his emergency response was chaotic. While fire at sea is inherently dangerous, Ioannis's incompetent response turned a manageable emergency into a total loss of the vessel. 9. In 1954, Captain Gunnar Nordenson of the Swedish passenger liner MS Drottningholm collided with a cargo ship in dense fog but was sailing at excessive speed despite limited visibility. The collision killed 3 crew members and severely damaged both vessels. Nordenson had ignored fog protocols requiring reduced speed. Maritime rules clearly require ships in fog to slow to a speed that allows stopping within the range of visibility. Nordenson maintained cruising speed, making collision inevitable when another vessel appeared. The incident was entirely preventable and resulted from Nordenson's impatience and schedule concerns overriding safety protocols. 10. In 1956, the Italian luxury liner SS Andrea Doria sank after colliding with the MS Stockholm in fog off Nantucket. Both captains, Piero Calamai of the Andrea Doria and Gunnar Nordenson of the Stockholm, made navigation errors that led to collision. Captain Calamai was traveling at 21.8 knots in dense fog, and both captains misinterpreted radar contacts, causing the ships to turn toward each other rather than away. The Stockholm's ice-strengthened bow pierced the Andrea Doria's side, flooding multiple compartments and causing the Andrea Doria to list so heavily that half the lifeboats couldn't be launched. The ship sank the next day. Remarkably, only 46 people died because other ships responded quickly to the SOS. Both captains survived, but Calamai's decision to maintain near-full speed in fog violated maritime protocol. The collision between 2 modern ships with radar in busy shipping lanes demonstrated that technology means nothing when captains ignore basic safety rules. 11. In 1987, Philippine ferry MV Doña Paz collided with oil tanker MT Vector because neither vessel's captain was maintaining proper lookout. Captain Augusto Caunsa of the Doña Paz was not on the bridge at the time of collision, leaving the ship under control of an unqualified crew member who was apparently watching TV. The collision ignited the Vector's cargo of petroleum, creating a massive fireball that engulfed both vessels. The Doña Paz was massively overloaded with an estimated 4,386 people aboard, despite being licensed for only 1,518 passengers. The ship sank within minutes, and the fire prevented effective rescue. Only 24 people survived. Over 4,300 people died in what remains the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. Captain Konka died in the disaster. Investigation was limited, but the catastrophe resulted from multiple failures. The Vector was operating with an expired license, and only 1 crew member on watch who was apparently asleep. The Doña Paz was grossly overloaded and operating with inadequate crew, and Captain Kawanka was not on the bridge in busy shipping lanes at night. The disaster killed more people than the Titanic, but remains less known internationally because it occurred in the developing world. Over 4,300 people died because neither captain was following basic maritime safety protocols. 12. In 2002, Captain Habib Ullah of the Senegalese ferry, MV Le Jula, was overloaded the vessel to more than double its legal capacity and set sail in rough seas. The ferry was certified for 580 passengers but carried an estimated 1,928 people. When the overloaded ferry encountered rough seas, it capsized within minutes. The ship had inadequate lifeboats and safety equipment for even its legal capacity, let alone the actual number aboard. At least 1,263 people died in one of history's worst maritime disasters. Captain Ula survived and was arrested. Investigation revealed systematic violations including massive overloading, inadequate safety equipment, poor maintenance, and Ula's decision to sail in weather conditions the overloaded vessel couldn't handle. The disaster devastated Senegal, with many families losing multiple members. Captain Ula's willingness to overload his vessel for profit directly killed over 800 people who trusted him to get them safely to their destination. 13. In 1912, Canadian Pacific steamship RMS Empress of Ireland sank after collision with the Norwegian coal ship Storstad in the St. Lawrence River. Captain Henry Kendall of the Empress was navigating in fog when he encountered the Storstad. Both captains made navigation errors, but Kendall's decision to reverse engines in an attempt to avoid collision actually made collision more likely by slowing his ship and reducing steering capability. The Storstad struck the Empress, opening a massive hole that flooded the vessel within 14 minutes. Of 1,477 people aboard, 1,012 died, the highest percentage loss of any major civilian maritime disaster. Captain Kendall survived and testified that he'd sounded fog signals and taken appropriate action, but investigation found both captains had mishandled the situation. The Empress of Ireland disaster remains one of Canada's worst maritime catastrophes, occurring barely 2 years after the Titanic with similar loss percentages. Over 1,000 people died because 2 captains couldn't properly navigate through fog. 14. In 1945, German U-boat U-1206 sank because Captain Karl Adolf Schlitt improperly operated the submarine's new high-tech toilet system. U-boats had notoriously difficult waste systems, and the U-1206 had a new high-pressure toilet that required specific procedures. Schlitt used the toilet incorrectly, and when an engineer tried to help, he opened the wrong valve. Seawater began flooding into the submarine. The flooding reached the submarine's batteries, creating chlorine gas. Schlitt was forced to surface, where Allied aircraft immediately spotted the U-boat. Under attack and unable to submerge due to continuing flooding, Schlitt ordered the crew to abandon ship and scuttled U-1206. 4 crew members died. The U-boat sank because its captain couldn't figure out how to flush a toilet. The U-1206 disaster became one of history's most embarrassing military losses and demonstrated that even advanced technology is worthless if the captain doesn't know how to use it. Schlitt survived, but his career was destroyed by the humiliating circumstances of his submarine's loss. 15. In 2007, Captain Iakovos Georgoudis of the cruise ship MS Sea Diamond struck a well-charted reef near Santorini while attempting to enter the port. Georgoudis was apparently distracted and navigating too close to shore in restricted waters. The ship struck known rocks, tearing open the hull and flooding multiple compartments. Georgoudis ordered evacuation, and all but 2 passengers were rescued. 2 French passengers were unaccounted for and presumed drowned inside the ship. The Sea Diamond sank in environmentally sensitive waters, spilling fuel oil and causing significant pollution. Investigation revealed Georgoudis had sailed inside the prohibited zone and wasn't paying adequate attention to navigation in confined waters. He was convicted of negligence and sentenced to prison. The ship was a total loss, and 2 people died because the captain sailed where he shouldn't have been and wasn't paying attention. The sunken wreck remained a pollution threat and tourism eyesore for years. 16. In 1944, USS Indianapolis delivered atomic bomb components to Tinian Island, then was torpedoed by Japanese submarine I-58 while sailing without escort. Captain Charles McVeigh III was not informed that an escort had been planned, but canceled, and he was not given intelligence about Japanese submarine activity in his path despite Navy having broken Japanese codes. The Indianapolis sank in 12 minutes, with approximately 300 men going down with the ship. The remaining 900 sailors floated in shark-infested waters for 4 days before rescue because the Navy failed to notice the ship never arrived at its destination and didn't organize search. only 316 men survived. McVeigh was controversially court-martialed for not zigzagging and for failing to abandon ship in time. He was convicted of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, though evidence showed zigzagging in darkness wouldn't have prevented the torpedo hit. McVeigh was the only captain in U.S. Navy history court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action. The controversy destroyed McVeigh, who received hate mail from survivors' families for decades. He committed suicide in 1968. McVeigh was posthumously exonerated in 2000. While technically McVeigh was following orders and the Navy's failures were more significant than his inclusion here reflects the tragedy of a captain held responsible for a disaster caused primarily by systemic failures. The Indianapolis sinking remains controversial regarding McVeigh's culpability versus Navy scapegoating. 17. In 2000, Captain Giannis Avranis of the cruise ship MTS Oceanos abandoned ship during a storm off South Africa, while hundreds of passengers and crew remained aboard. A storm caused flooding in the engine room, leading to power loss. As the ship began sinking, Avranis ordered evacuation, but then fled in one of the first lifeboats, leaving passengers behind without leadership. The ship's entertainers, particularly musician Moss Hills, took charge of coordinating evacuation by helicopter from the sinking vessel. All 571 people aboard were eventually rescued by South African military helicopters in a remarkable rescue operation. But the evacuation was coordinated by entertainment staff, while the captain was already ashore. Avranis defended his actions by claiming he needed to coordinate rescue from shore, and that passengers were better off with entertainers organizing helicopter rescue. The maritime community and public were appalled. Avranis was effectively blacklisted from ever commanding again. While everyone survived, Avranis' decision to abandon his ship while passengers remained aboard violated maritime tradition and law. He became synonymous with cowardice, and the Oceanos incident remains a cautionary tale about captains abandoning their responsibilities. 18. In 1994, ferry MS Estonia's Captain Arvo Andresen failed to recognize signs of structural failure and continued operating in heavy seas that eventually led to the bow visor detaching. Andresen had been a pilot and ferry captain, but was relatively new to the Estonia. As the vessel traveled through a storm, crew reported loud metallic noises from the bow area, an indication that the bow visor was failing. Andresen didn't investigate adequately or reduce speed. When the visor eventually detached and the bow door opened, the car deck flooded rapidly. Andresen attempted to turn the ship towards shore, but the flooding was too rapid. The ship capsized and sank within 30-35 minutes. Andresen went down with the ship. Of 989 people aboard, only 137 survived. Over 850 people died, partly because Andresen didn't recognize warning signs and take appropriate action when crew reported unusual noises from the bow. While the visor's structural failure was the mechanical cause, Andresen's failure to investigate and reduce speed when warned allowed the failure to become catastrophic. 19. In 1915, Captain William Turner of the ocean liner RMS Lusitania ignored British Admiralty warnings about German U-boats operating off Ireland and failed to zigzag or take other defensive measures. The Lusitania was sailing from New York to Liverpool during World War I when Germany had declared the waters around Britain a war zone and threatened to sink merchant ships. Turner received multiple warnings about U-boat activity, but maintained course and speed, apparently confident that the Lusitania's speed would protect it. German submarine U-20 torpedoed the Lusitania off the Irish coast. A secondary explosion, possibly boiler explosion or ammunition cargo, caused the ship to sink in just 18 minutes. Of 1,959 people aboard, 1,197 died, including 128 Americans. The sinking helped turn American public opinion against Germany and contributed to U.S. entry into World War I. Turner survived and faced inquiry but was cleared of wrongdoing, partly because Britain wanted to emphasize German guilt rather than Turner's negligence. However, Turner's failure to follow Admiralty instructions regarding zigzagging and coastal routing contributed to the disaster. The Lusitania's sinking remains controversial regarding whether Turner followed orders and whether Britain deliberately allowed the attack to bring America into the war. Over 1,000 people died in a sinking that could have been avoided if the captain had followed defensive sailing protocols. 20. In 1987, Captain Nassos Papadopoulos of the Greek ferry express Samina struck rocks near Paros Island in calm, clear conditions because he was watching a soccer match on TV instead of supervising navigation. The ferry was on autopilot and neither Papadopoulos nor other officers were on the bridge. The ship struck the well-charted Portes Islets at full speed, tearing open the hull. The ferry sank within 45 minutes. Of 533 people aboard, 82 died. Papadopoulos initially tried to blame the accident on technical failure, but investigation revealed he'd been watching TV in his cabin while the ship was on autopilot in confined waters where manual navigation was required. Papadopoulos was convicted of manslaughter and negligence and sentenced to prison. The Express Samina disaster shocked Greece and led to increased scrutiny of ferry safety. 82 people died because their captain wanted to watch soccer instead of doing his job. The disaster was entirely preventable and represented gross negligence that violated every principle of maritime safety. 21. In 1953, ferry MV Princess Victoria sank in a storm in the North Channel between Scotland and Northern Ireland because Captain James Ferguson kept cargo doors open during rough seas and failed to secure vehicles on the car deck. The ferry encountered severe weather, and waves began flooding the car deck through doors that should have been sealed. Water sloshing on the car deck caused stability problems, and Ferguson's delayed response to the flooding allowed too much water to accumulate. The ferry foundered and sank. Of 179 people aboard, 133 died, including Ferguson. Investigation revealed that Ferguson hadn't adequately secured the car deck or closed doors that should have been sealed in rough weather. His delayed response to the flooding, hoping the weather would improve rather than taking immediate action, allowed the situation to become catastrophic. The Princess Victoria disaster led to improved ferry safety regulations, but 133 people died because the captain didn't properly secure his vessel before sailing into a storm. 22. In 1916, hospital ship HMHS Britannic, sister ship to the Titanic, sank in the Aegean Sea after striking a mine while under the command of Captain Charles Bartlett. Bartlett's controversial decision to continue moving forward at speed after the explosion rather than immediately stopping engines may have accelerated the sinking by forcing more water through the damaged hull. The Britannic sank in just 55 minutes. Despite being a hospital ship with full medical staff and lifeboats, 30 people died when 2 lifeboats were launched prematurely and sucked into the ship's still-turning propellers. Bartlett survived and testified that he'd attempted to beach the ship rather than stopping, which was why he'd kept engines running. However, continuing forward motion after catastrophic hull damage likely doomed the ship. The Britannic sinking showed that even with lessons learned from the Titanic disaster, captain decisions during emergencies could still result in unnecessary deaths. 23. In 2004, Captain John Loftus of the Bahamian-registered cruise ship Norwegian Dawn sailed directly into a major storm off the U.S. East Coast, despite weather forecasts showing the storm's severity and path. The ship encountered 70-foot waves that smashed windows on the upper decks, flooded cabins, and injured several passengers. While the ship didn't sink, the damage was extensive and the danger to passengers was significant. Investigation revealed Loftus had been more concerned with maintaining schedule than passenger safety. He'd received weather updates showing the storm, but made only minor course adjustments rather than significantly altering course or delaying. Norwegian Dawn limped into Charleston, South Carolina with significant damage. Passengers filed lawsuits claiming Loftus had recklessly endangered them. The incident showed that modern cruise ships with advanced weather forecasting can still encounter disasters when captains prioritize schedules over safety. 24. In 1991, Salem Express ferry sank in the Red Sea after Captain Hassan Morrow ignored storm warnings and sailed directly into reef-filled waters at night during rough conditions. The ferry was carrying Egyptian pilgrims returning from Mecca. Morrow apparently took a shortcut through dangerous waters to make up time lost to the storm. The ferry struck a reef and sank within 20 minutes. Official records claimed 470 died, but the ferry was significantly overloaded and actual deaths may have exceeded 1,000. Captain Morrow went down with the ship. The Salem Express disaster remains controversial due to government cover-up of the true death toll and the exact circumstances. The ferry was ancient, overloaded, and poorly maintained, but Morrow's decision to navigate through reef-infested waters at night during a storm turned those existing problems into catastrophe. The wreck remains a popular dive site, though divers' report finding remains suggesting far more deaths than officially acknowledged. 25. In 1854, SS Arctic collided with the French steamer Vesta in fog off Newfoundland. Captain James Luce of the Arctic was traveling at excessive speed in dense fog. After the collision, Luce lost control of his crew and passengers as panic set out. Lifeboats were launched chaotically, with crew fighting passengers for seats. Women and children who were supposed to receive priority were left behind as crew members fled. The Arctic sank with approximately 350 people. Only 85 survived, primarily crew members who had seized lifeboats. Captain Luce's wife, son, and daughter were among the dead. Luce survived and faced intense criticism for losing control of his crew and failing to ensure women and children were evacuated first. The Arctic disaster predated the Titanic by 58 years but showed similar problems: excessive speed in dangerous conditions, inadequate lifeboats, and chaotic evacuation. Luce's decisions before and after the collision turned an accident into a massacre. 26. In 1979, Fastnet Race Yacht Race became a disaster when 15 participants died during a severe storm. While not merchant vessels, many yacht captains made fatal decisions to continue racing despite weather warnings rather than seeking shelter. Over 300 boats started the race, but when the storm hit with winds exceeding 60 knots and waves over 50 feet, many skippers were unprepared and didn't know proper storm tactics. 5 yachts sank and many crew were swept overboard. Multiple captains abandoned their yachts even though the vessels weren't sinking, leading to unnecessary deaths. Investigation revealed many captains lacked the experience for offshore racing in severe weather and had made numerous errors, including abandoning vessels that were actually safe. The Fastnet disaster led to major changes in offshore racing safety requirements, but 15 people died because amateur captains made poor decisions in conditions beyond their skill level. 27. In 1942, ocean liner SS Normandy caught fire and capsized at a New York pier while being converted to a troop ship. While technically the ship was under naval control rather than merchant captain, Captain Clayton M. Simmers was responsible during conversion. The fire started from a welder's torch igniting life jackets. Simmers' emergency response was inadequate, and firefighting efforts pumped so much water into the upper decks that the ship became top-heavy and capsized at the pier. One person died, but the Normandy, one of the most luxurious ocean liners ever built, was destroyed. Salvage efforts raised the ship, but it was scrapped rather than repaired. Investigation revealed inadequate fire safety during conversion and poor firefighting tactics that caused the capsizing. The Normandy disaster represented one of the great wastes in maritime history, a magnificent ship destroyed at dock through negligence and incompetent emergency response. 28. In 1916, ferry SS Qiangya was overloaded and struck a mine in the Huangpu River near Shanghai in 1948. Captain Fang Zhongping had overloaded the vessel with an estimated 2,750 to 3,120 people aboard, despite being licensed for 186. When the ship struck a mine left over from World War II, it sank within minutes. Estimated deaths range from 2,750 to over 4,000, making it potentially the deadliest maritime disaster in history. Captain Fang died in the disaster. The exact circumstances remain unclear due to the chaos of the Chinese Civil War occurring at the time. But Fang's decision to massively overload his vessel meant that when the mine struck, evacuation was impossible. The Qiangya disaster remains less known internationally, but represents one of history's greatest loss-of-life events at sea. 29. In 1987, passenger ferry Doña Marilyn sank during Typhoon Sisong in the Philippines. Captain Agripino Uson sailed into typhoon conditions despite weather warnings, apparently under pressure to maintain schedule. The ferry sank, killing an estimated 261 people. Captain Uson survived. Investigation revealed the ferry was overloaded, and Uson had ignored weather warnings. He was convicted of reckless imprudence and sentenced to prison. The Doña Marilyn disaster was one of several Philippines ferry disasters caused by overloading and captains sailing in dangerous weather conditions. Over 260 people died because their captain prioritized schedule over safety during an active typhoon. 30. In 1994, color line ferry MS Scandinavian Star caught fire while sailing from Norway to Denmark. While the fire was caused by arson, Captain Hugo Larsson's emergency response was catastrophic. Larsson failed to order proper evacuation, didn't coordinate with crew regarding firefighting, and appeared confused and panicked. The fire spread through the ship and many passengers died from smoke inhalation in their cabins. Of 439 people aboard, 158 died. Investigation revealed numerous failures, including inadequate crew training, language barriers, multinational crew couldn't communicate effectively, and Larsson's incompetent command during the emergency. While arson started the fire, Larsson's failure to properly command during the emergency turned a manageable situation into a mass casualty event. He was heavily criticized but not criminally charged because the arson was considered the primary cause. 31. In 2006, ferry Al Salam Boccaccio 98 sank in the Red Sea while sailing from Saudi Arabia to Egypt. Captain Hassan Khalil ignored reports of fire in the engine room for over an hour, allowing the fire to spread uncontrolled. When the fire finally disabled the engines and caused flooding, evacuation became chaotic. The ship sank in rough seas. Of approximately 1,400 people aboard, at least 1,000 died. Captain Khalil went down with the ship. Investigation revealed the ferry had inadequate safety equipment, wasn't properly maintained, and Khalil had delayed reporting the fire and ordering evacuation. The Al Salam Boccaccio disaster remains one of Egypt's worst maritime catastrophes. Over 1,000 people died because their captain didn't take fire seriously until it was too late and the ship was already lost. 32. In 1865, steamboat SS Sultana exploded and sank on the Mississippi River. Captain James Mason had overloaded the vessel with approximately 2,400 passengers, mostly Union soldiers being released from Confederate prison camps, despite the boat being rated for only 376 passengers. Mason received payment per soldier transported, incentivizing overloading. The ship's boilers were already damaged and poorly repaired. The overloaded vessel's boilers exploded near Memphis, causing the ship to burn and sink. Estimated deaths range from 1,547 to 1,800, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. Captain Mason died in the explosion. The Sultana disaster received little attention because it occurred just after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and the end of the Civil War dominated news. Mason's greed-driven overloading directly caused the disaster. Properly loaded, the Sultana might have completed the journey despite the damaged boilers. Over 1,500 soldiers who survived Civil War prison camps died because a captain overloaded his ship for profit. 33. In 2009, ferry Rabal Queen sank off Papua New Guinea. Captain Wari Tau was navigating in rough seas when the ferry began taking on water. Tau's inadequate response to the flooding and delayed evacuation order caused the ship to sink before effective evacuation could occur. At least 146 people died. Tau survived and was initially investigated, but charges were not filed. Investigation revealed the ferry was overloaded and Tau had sailed in conditions the vessel shouldn't have encountered. The Rabal Queen disaster showed that ferry tragedies continue occurring in developing nations where overloading and inadequate safety enforcement remain common. 34. In 2002, ferry MV Salahuddin II capsized during a storm in Bangladesh. Captain Mosla Udin had overloaded the vessel with an estimated 400 passengers, despite capacity of 150. When storm conditions caused the overloaded ferry to become unstable, it capsized and sank rapidly. At least 350 people died. Captain Udin survived and faced charges. Bangladesh suffers frequent ferry disasters due to overloading and captains sailing in dangerous conditions. The Salahuddin II disaster was typical of tragedies where economic pressure to maximize passengers and maintain schedules leads captains to make fatal decisions. 35. In 1968, submarine USS Scorpion sank in the Atlantic Ocean with all 99 crew members. Captain Francis Slattery was commanding the submarine on return from deployment when it sank under mysterious circumstances. While the exact cause remains debated, possibilities include torpedo malfunction, mechanical failure, or hostile action. The Navy concluded that Scorpion suffered catastrophic failure. Investigation suggested Slattery may have ordered the submarine to deeper depths than safe while investigating problems, though this remains unconfirmed. The Scorpion disaster remains one of the U.S. Navy's enduring mysteries. While not definitively proven to be captain error, questions remain about decisions made before the sinking. All 99 crew members died. 36. In 1993, Russian cruise ship Academic Sergei Vavilov ran aground in the Antarctic Peninsula because Captain Vyacheslav Gribanov was navigating too close to shore in poorly charted waters. The ship grounded but didn't sink, and all passengers and crew were evacuated. However, the grounding damaged Antarctica's fragile environment and resulted in fuel spills. Gribanov's reckless navigation in Antarctic waters demonstrated that even scientific vessels with experienced captains can make dangerous errors when overconfident. The incident led to increased scrutiny of Antarctic tourism and shipping operations. 37. In 2012, cargo ship MV Rena ran aground on Astrolabe Reef off New Zealand because Captain Mauro Balomaga was taking a shortcut and not paying adequate attention to navigation. The ship struck the well-charted reef at full speed, tearing open the hull and causing containers and oil to spill into the ocean. The environmental damage was significant, and the ship eventually broke in two and sank. Captain Balomaga and Navigation Officer Leonil Rilon were convicted of operating a vessel causing unnecessary danger and sentenced to prison. Rare criminal convictions for ship captains. Investigation revealed Balomaga had altered course to reach port faster and wasn't properly supervising navigation. The Rena disaster caused New Zealand's worst maritime environmental disaster. The ship broke apart and sank because the captain was in a hurry and wasn't paying attention. 38. In 1918, Princess Sophia struck Vanderbilt Reef in Alaska and remained grounded overnight with all 353 people aboard still on the ship. Captain Leonard Locke decided to wait for high tide rather than immediately evacuating because the weather was calm and the ship appeared stable. During the night, a storm came up and waves broke the ship apart. All 353 people died when the ship sank. Captain Locke's decision to wait rather than evacuate immediately turned to grounding, with no initial casualties and a total loss of life. The Princess Sophia disaster remains Alaska's worst maritime catastrophe. Every person died because the captain thought waiting was safer than immediate evacuation. 39. In 1947, Greek steamer Himara struck a mine in the Danube River and sank. Captain Theodore Kondylis had been warned about mines in the area but sailed anyway, apparently believing his route was safe. The mine explosion sank the ship rapidly, killing approximately 172 people. The Danube had numerous unmapped mines remaining from World War II, but Kondylis ignored warnings about the danger. His decision to sail through known minefields killed over 170 people who trusted him to navigate safely. 40. In 1987, Ferry Herald of Free Enterprise capsized. Already mentioned earlier, but worth revisiting, because the corporate culture pressured captains to maintain impossible schedules. Captain David Lurie sailed with bow doors open because checking them would have delayed departure. The pressure from management to prioritize schedule over safety created an environment where captains felt they couldn't take time for proper safety checks. While Lurie bears direct responsibility, the systemic pressure that caused him to prioritize schedule represents a broader problem in maritime industries. The 193 deaths resulted from a captain making a decision shaped by corporate pressure that prioritized profits over lives. 41. In 2011, cruise ship Costa Concordia, mentioned earlier, demonstrated that modern safety equipment and advanced technology mean nothing when captains make catastrophically stupid decisions. Captain Schettino's unauthorized course deviation, the rocks he hit, and his subsequent abandonment of ship while passengers died represented some of the worst captain behavior in modern maritime history. The disaster occurred while the ship had functioning communications, nearby rescue resources, and modern life-saving equipment. The 32 deaths resulted purely from captain error and cowardice. Schettino's name became synonymous with incompetence and cowardice, and his 16-year prison sentence reflected the criminal nature of his actions. 42. In 1998, ferry MS Princess of the Orient sank during Typhoon Loleng in the Philippines. Captain Hernani Apostol sailed into typhoon conditions despite weather warnings. The ferry sank with estimated deaths of 150 people. Captain Apostol survived. Investigation revealed the ferry shouldn't have sailed during an active typhoon, but schedule pressure and economic considerations led Apostol to sail anyway. The disaster was another example of Philippines ferry captains prioritizing schedule and revenue over passenger safety. Over 150 people died because their captains sailed into a typhoon. 43. In 1916, ferry SS Kiangya, mentioned earlier, sank after striking a mine while massively overloaded. Captain Fang Zhongping's decision to overload the vessel meant evacuation was impossible when the mine struck. The disaster potentially killed over 4,000 people, making it history's deadliest maritime disaster by some estimates. While the mine was the proximate cause, Fang's overloading meant that what might have been survivable became catastrophic. Thousands died because their captain prioritized profit over safety. 44. In 1945, German refugee ship MV Goya was torpedoed by Soviet submarine in the Baltic Sea. Captain Vladimir Konovalov of the Soviet submarine L-3 torpedoed the clearly marked refugee ship, sinking it within 7 minutes and killing approximately 6,900 people, mostly German refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. While Konovalov was following orders to sink German shipping, the Goya was clearly marked as carrying refugees and civilians. The massacre represented war crime rather than legitimate military action. Over 6,900 people died in what remains one of history's deadliest maritime disasters. Konovalov was celebrated as a Soviet hero, receiving the Order of Lenin for the sinking. The Goya disaster remains controversial regarding whether Konovalov knew he was targeting refugees. 45. And finally, in 2023, the submersible Titan imploded while diving to view the Titanic wreck, killing all 5 people aboard, including the pilot, captain. While technically not a ship, Captain Stockton Rush of OceanGate was piloting an experimental submersible that multiple experts had warned was unsafe. Rush had dismissed safety concerns, fired employees who raised issues, and claimed regulations were stifling innovation. The Titan's carbon fiber hull wasn't properly certified for the depths attempted, and the submersible lacked basic safety features. Multiple dives had caused cumulative damage to the hull. On what would be the Titan's final dive, the hull catastrophically failed at approximately 3,500 meters depth, causing instant death for all aboard. Rush's decisions to ignore safety warnings, use experimental materials without proper testing, and repeatedly dive a damaged hull ultimately killed him and 4 others. The Titan disaster demonstrated that even in the 21st century, with all available technology and knowledge, captain arrogance and disregard for safety can still result in entirely preventable catastrophic losses. The irony of dying while visiting the Titanic, a ship that sank because its captain ignored warnings and was overconfident in technology, was not lost on observers. 5 people died because a captain believed he was smarter than established safety protocols and the experts who warned him. Here's the brutal truth about maritime disasters. The vast majority are preventable and result from captain error, arrogance, negligence, or willingness to prioritize schedule and profit over safety. The ocean is unforgiving, and ships are complex machines operating in dangerous environments. But that's precisely why captains must exercise extreme caution and follow established safety protocols. Every disaster in this video resulted from captains who thought they knew better, couldn't be bothered to follow rules, were overconfident in their judgment or their vessels, or simply valued money and time more than lives. The real shipwreck was the trust passengers placed in captains who failed them. Every person who died in these disasters trusted their captain to navigate safely, respond appropriately to emergencies, and prioritize passenger safety over all other concerns. That trust was betrayed by captains who made catastrophically stupid decisions, or simply abandoned their responsibilities when disaster struck. History's lesson is clear. Being a ship captain requires not just technical skill, but judgment, humility, adherence to safety protocols, and willingness to prioritize safety over schedule, profit, or ego. The captains in this video failed in these responsibilities, and their failures killed thousands of people who trusted them with their lives. Subscribe if you want to remember that when you board any vessel, you're trusting your life to the captain's judgment and competence. And remember that maritime disasters almost always begin with a captain making a bad decision that could have been avoided by simply following established rules designed to keep people alive.